Okay, let's dive into a high-stakes showdown that's happening right now between the U.S. and China. But we're not talking about troops or territory. Nope. This is a war over something much, much smaller: semiconductors. You know, the tiny electronic brains that basically run our entire world.
So, just how real is this conflict? Well, start with this number: $5.5 billion. That is the potential revenue hit for just one company, the AI giant Nvidia, that's caught right in the crossfire of this escalating chip war.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to look at the U.S. ban that really kicked this whole thing off. Then we'll see the billion-dollar fallout for a company like Nvidia. After that, we'll cover China's countermove, see how global supply chains are being totally redrawn, and finally, ask what this all means for the future race for dominance. All right, so our story really begins with the move that absolutely shook the tech world, a series of sweeping U.S. export controls that fired the first major shots in this whole conflict. But what are we really fighting over here? Well, at its heart, it's a struggle for control over these things: semiconductors. And you gotta think of them less as simple components and more like the foundational building blocks for, well, everything in our modern world, powering everything from your phone to the most advanced AI you can imagine. Now, this didn't just happen overnight. The pressure really ramped up. Back in October 2022, the US banned its top-of-the-line AI chips from going to China. So what happened? Companies like Nvidia got clever and designed slightly less powerful workaround chips. But then, the US just tightened the rules again, banning those too. So what's the official strategy from the US side? You can really think about it in two parts. On defense, it's all about national security, keeping advanced AI tech out of China's military and making sure the US keeps its technological edge. But then there's the offense, and that's all about economics, using big policies like the CHIPS Act to try and rebuild the domestic chip industry. These big, abstract policies had some very real and very immediate consequences. And you could say that ground zero for the impact was Nvidia, a single company that suddenly had a multi-billion-dollar problem on its hands. And to really get why this was such a huge deal, you have to understand Nvidia's journey. I mean, this is a company that completely transformed itself from making graphics cards for gamers into the undisputed powerhouse of the AI revolution. Their chips are, for all intents and purposes, the essential engine for pretty much all modern AI development. And that brings us right back to this number. See, after that first ban, Nvidia spent millions developing those compliant workaround chips specifically for the Chinese market. But when the rules tightened again, that entire new product line was suddenly worthless for that market, creating a potential $5.5 billion hole in their revenue. Ouch. But the pain went way beyond just that initial lost revenue. Demand from what was a massive market in China just plummeted, which of course shook investor confidence. And all this constant uncertainty made it way harder for Nvidia to plan new products or even just support its existing customers in the region. It was a massive disruption to their whole business model. So, faced with all this escalating pressure, Beijing wasn't just going to sit back and take it. It prepared its own strategic countermove. It was time for China to strike back. This little chart shows the tit-for-tat nature of this conflict perfectly. The U.S. action was to block the finished high-tech chips from going to China. China's reaction? To restrict the raw materials, we're talking stuff like gallium and germanium, that are needed to make those very chips in the first place. It was a direct and very calculated retaliation. But China's response was so much more than just simple retaliation. It kicked off this massive, long-term strategic mission for total self-sufficiency. They are now pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into building their own domestic chip industry from the ground up, propping up national champions like Huawei, and pushing their huge local industries to buy homegrown technology. So the big question is, can they actually pull it off? Well, for now, a pretty significant technology gap remains. Most experts estimate China's domestic industry is still about 5 years behind the world leaders. Closing that gap has become a top national priority. Now, this conflict isn't happening in a vacuum. Not at all. The shockwaves are forcing the entire global supply chain to basically rewire itself, which is compelling other nations to adjust and, in some cases, even take sides. To really grasp the global stakes here, just look at the size of this market. Today, the semiconductor industry is worth over $500 billion. It is, quite literally, the central nervous system of the entire global economy. And it's only getting bigger. By 2030, this market is projected to hit $1 trillion. Yeah, a trillion. So everyone understands that controlling this industry means controlling the future of technology and economic power. That's why this fight is so incredibly intense.
But here's the thing. Just decoupling is nearly impossible. The whole system is just too deeply entangled. You've got the U.S. largely dominating chip design, China serving as this massive manufacturing hub and key market, and the EU as a critical partner and consumer for both of them. You can't just pull on one of these threads without the whole thing starting to unravel.
And all of this has put traditional U.S. allies, especially in Europe, in a really tough spot. Worried about getting caught in the middle of this tug-of-war, they've started to de-risk. And in simple terms, that just means they're actively looking for alternative suppliers everywhere but the U.S. or China, hoping to reduce their dependence on either of the superpowers. So, all of this disruption and rewiring leads to the ultimate question. What does the future of technology even look like now? And who's going to win this long-term race for dominance? Look, the U.S. may have the technological edge today, but that lead is definitely not guaranteed. A recent global survey revealed something pretty stunning. A significant number of people out there believe China could actually outpace both the U.S. and the EU in tech innovation within the next 50 years. This leaves us facing two very different potential futures. On one hand, you have the decoupling scenario, which could lead to two parallel tech ecosystems with totally different standards, sort of like a digital iron curtain. But then there's the innovation paradox, the ironic possibility that all these U.S. bans might actually force China to innovate faster, ultimately speeding up its own technological independence. When you boil it all down, the chip war is so much bigger than any one country or any one company. It's a fundamental conflict that is actively redrawing the map of global power, and the consequences will affect everything from the phone in your pocket to our collective national security. And that leaves us with one final big question. Will this rivalry, this fracturing of the tech world, spark a brand new era of hyper-competitive, super-fast innovation? Or will it just lead to inefficiency, redundancy, and maybe even a kind of global technological stagnation? The answer to that is going to define the next 50 years.